Hi, everyone. Welcome. We've got an absolutely exciting panel. You heard from Sally Benson and others this morning, and obviously I would assume everyone is aware, even North Carolina, that we had a big event in December in Paris where the countries of the world came together and said we are making commitments for climate change. So what this panel is about is some of the really leaders on implementation and steps that can be taken to address climate change are going to be talking. I want to give one alert at the beginning, which is they're all going to be saying a few words about the steps that they've been taking, which are fascinating. I'll probably ask a question or two, but then this is going to be the chance where we're going to be asking questions from the audience that we appreciate very much all the thoughtful attention that you've been giving, listening to our speakers so far, but we want to have some interaction. And so please start thinking about if there are areas where you'd like to hear more. So our panel, I'll just introduce everybody and then we'll get started. Right next to me is Alicia Seiger, and she is here at Stanford. She's the deputy director of one of our centers, the Steyer-Taylor Center for Policy and Finance. I'm not going to give more information on the bios of these women. They are in our materials and posted online because we want to get right into the substance of the discussion. Next to Alicia is Melanie Nakagawa, and she is with the State Department, and she has a wonderful job title, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation in the Energy Bureau, and she's been very involved with the State Department of looking at what implementation looks like from the Paris commitments. And then our third and final speaker is Maria Rigatti, and she's with one of the leading utilities, not just in California, but nationally and internationally, Southern California Edison, that is really moving ahead on a clean energy path. And we congratulate Maria because it was just announced that she is moving into an even larger leadership position this fall with the parent holding company, Edison International. And she has very much been involved in all of these. She's the chief financial officer at Southern California Edison, will be taking that position, then at the holding company, and is also a senior vice president. So if we could just start with Melanie, you're talking a little bit about, from your perspective, what are some of the issues and important steps ahead on implementation?
Great, well, thank you so much. Well, it's great to be here and really looking forward, as you, Diane, mentioned, the interactive portion. It's a great crowd that's gathered here today, and I think it's really important to hear some of the questions that are coming to your mind and really have a much more interactive discussion with all of you. As Diane mentioned, I'm Melanie Nakagawa. I'm with the State Department in the Energy Resources Bureau, where I'm proud to say that of the 4 leadership positions within the Energy Bureau, 3 of them are occupied by women, and it's a really exciting place to be at this moment. We were created about 5 years ago, so many of you may not be aware that the Energy Resources or the Energy Bureau is actually quite new in the bureaucracy of the State Department, and really was created because it was talking about the important role that energy plays at the nexus of economic development and national security, and is a real core part of our fabric in the foreign policy apparatus. And so since those 5 years, it's been a really exciting time where we've worked on a range of issues across the spectrum of energy, from oil and gas to renewables. And in my portfolio, as it's mentioned, it's really focused on transformation. And it's focused on how do you talk about energy security with basically a broader aperture. So looking at energy security from the perspective of not just keeping yourselves warm or cold wherever you may be living for this winter, but how do you also create the path more sustainably for the future years to come? We saw this most predominantly in places like Eastern Europe, where we're looking at more traditional fuels for the near-term future, but then also trying to lay the groundwork for energy efficiency, increased use in building codes and standards to help create more of an incentive for that, and also different types of alternative resources that could also be fueling key regions and key countries, particularly in Eastern Europe. And so that's type of the work that we've been doing, and part of my role is really to think about that spectrum of energy and understanding that it's, as many of us know, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do both renewable resources and traditional energy resources at the same time, and it's really important. So it's been a really great time to be there. We're also looking at how do you deploy innovative business models, market structures, different types of policy reforms, and really what does energy diplomacy mean? And how do you define energy diplomacy? So I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about what that is and what my role in that space looks like. But given that this is a panel about Paris and I'm the pleasure of being the first speaker, I'll just quickly give a quick sort of a pivot from where we are now that the Paris Agreement has happened last December. It was an incredible moment. I had the honor of being there on the ground for it, and it was quite exciting. So for those who are in the room that could be there, it was really quite a wonderful moment in history. And what's been great about it is also what it meant for 2016, this year in particular. Everywhere we go and everywhere we travel, there's actually now quite a pull from many countries actually asking for support and asking questions on how do we actually make this transformation happen. Going into Paris, it was about putting forward ambitious targets and commitments and different types of actions countries could take or wanted to take in the 2020 or 2030 timeframe. But now 2016 is about how do we make that real? So my job and what we're doing at the State Department is really trying to turn the ambition into actions, turning some of the rhetoric into reality. Yes, we're into catchphrases. It's easy to remember. But it really is about how do you make Paris real and concrete? How do you build confidence that countries that took the ambition and took that first step to put something really forward-leaning on the table can actually make that happen? And at the department, we really feel that we have the best tools and a lot of tools actually to help countries get on that right glide path. So when that clock ticks forward and they have to true up on those commitments, they're well on their way there, or they've actually surpassed them. So in particular, we're looking at targeted countries, targeted regions, countries that are demanding or asking for our assistance, and really marshaling a whole of government approach. We have a strong team within the Department of Energy, as well as other areas and other agencies within the department and within the U.S. government that are really incredibly helpful in providing this sort of SWAT team approach and deploying technology solutions, policy solutions, finance solutions. But that really gets to that next point of what we're doing more of, which is partnerships, collaborations, and meetings like this and talking with all of you. How do we, frankly, in 2016, it's also about jumping on moving trains. So how do we jump on an existing initiative or existing efforts where having the U.S. government or U.S. government presence, we have embassies and posts around the world in over, 200 places. How do we deploy our ambassador and other senior foreign policy diplomats to championing these issues and work with governments to break through some of those systemic barriers that are preventing the large-scale investment, the large-scale finance from happening? And that's another key area that we're trying to do more of, whether it's in Central America, in the Caribbean, in the Asian, in ASEAN region, or even in Africa through off-grid initiatives like Beyond the Grid. We're also looking at the institutional scaffolding. So a lot of the work that we also play is on the connective tissue. How do you take the policy and regulatory environments, plus the technical know-how, and plus the private sector know-how, how do you bring them all together to really create the right scaffolding to actually see these ambitious targets and goals be achieved? Or frankly, in some places, how do you make it go even faster? And that's another key role that's been happening at the State Department and why I love my job, and it's been really exciting to be there. A couple pieces just to flag. In Paris, we had about over 188 countries put forward their nationally determined contributions, or targets, if you will. And of that, there's a significant amount. If you look at just the energy efficiency or energy productivity targets, I think one estimate, according to Sustainable Energy for All and another institute, said about 166 of those targets all mention energy efficiency or energy productivity in it. That's a great signal. It's a great signal of political will that they want to engage in this conversation and how to talk more about it. And in the space of energy efficiency and energy, or as we call it, energy productivity, it's a great conversation to have because it's about doing more, frankly, with less. And it's actually about how you can do more and actually how you merge the economic benefits, frankly, as well as the energy benefits all in the same story. And so we're looking at how do you amplify that story some more in many of those commitments. So that's a bit about sort of the post-Paris fabric and where we stand. And the other piece that I think is worth highlighting is where we are in clean energy. Bloomberg New Energy Finance put out numbers earlier this year in January, which all of us should know, 329. It's something that's sort of been burned into my brain. But 329 billion is an all-time high for clean energy investments last year, which is really significant, one, in that it's an all-time high. But at the State Department, we're using this as a message point or as a tool, frankly, to talk about what this means and what it means in the context of really low oil prices, a strong dollar, falling renewable costs and with traditional energy, and also what this means about what happened with Europe with some of the falling costs in Europe as well, which had traditionally been a powerhouse in keeping those numbers high. And so despite all those headwinds, as Michael Liebrich will point out from BNF, we still had an all-time high in renewable energy investments, which what we are now using and saying all around the world only shows that clean energy is profitable energy, and that there's money to be made and money is being made, and that the trend in this isn't something that can be stopped with a transition or a change in administration, but this is a trend that will continue and continue to continue. And how quick it continues, I think, is frankly up to us, but it's one that we can all feel confident is happening. And again, that's also what's contributing to a really exciting year in 2016 of what can be done and what we're doing to take advantage of that. I would just conclude a little bit more about what we're doing at state. And just two examples I would highlight is two regions. We'll go from the small to the big. In the case of the small, we've spent about 2.5 years working with St. Kitts and Nevis, islands in the Caribbean, on geothermal. This is an area where there had been a lot of geothermal interest and potential, but had yet to explore it or exploit it in any way. And a lot of that was due to systemic issues. They didn't have a standardized PPA. There were serious policy challenges, regulatory challenges. So 2 years of diplomatic work and engagement on the ground created the opportunity to actually move forward with a tender process, move forward with a PPA, and a consortium has now won that PPA to actually move forward with geothermal potential in the island of Nevis with potential to export because there's a lot of actually energy possibilities there. And it's just an example on a very small scale with concerted effort and diplomatic effort on an area how you can actually see progress happen. Now just flash forward to the big, India. 175 gigawatts is their target. It's quite large and it's quite exciting for many of the private sector in the room. It's one that many people are looking at. But as many of you, especially in the private sector, will know, it's very difficult. And it's a hard target to reach without finance and without the right types of investments. So hearing this and being supportive of India's aspirations, we created a US-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force. This task force has met several times. We've narrowed down the world and universe of opportunities of how do you actually help scale up finance in India, and came up with 3 fairly boring, frankly, for the press in the room. It's not something that's going to make a headline, but for those who actually work on this day to day, you'll probably be excited by it. We're working with them on standardizing a model PPA for utility scale. We're working with them on a warehousing facility for small scale rooftop. And we're also looking at a payment security mechanism, basically a mechanism to deal with off-taker risk that many of you may have encountered in India. And so we're working with a public-private sector consortium to really try to address this, and through the government task force, working with the government in India to help identify what are the policy changes that can happen to actually help unstick some of these project risks. Again, there are other macro issues to be dealt with, but from a project perspective, with those all interested in helping India reach this target, how do you deal with that project-based risk? And so those are some 3 areas where we're working with, and we think that with success in this, you could really start to see some more catalytic finance, larger scale finance be deployed in a country like India to help them make their transformation to a cleaner energy future and a lower carbon future. So that's just a quick snapshot. I'll turn back to you. Thank you.
Well, that certainly is very broad and comprehensive, but I think that's a wonderful segue then into Alicia with some of the work that you've been heading up here at Stanford and research into really how can we use finance on meeting our clean energy goals. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Thank you, Diane, and thank you to the teams at MIT and the Department of Energy and Stanford for putting this event together. It's really special to look out in this room and see so many leaders in energy who also happen to be women. And I have to say, it's the first energy conference I've ever been to where there's been a line for the ladies' room, so that was new. So I'll just tell you briefly a little bit about the center, the problems that I think about solving, and some of the solutions that we're working on. So as Diane said, you just heard from Melanie about thinking about how to move countries. I think about how to move private capital. So the Steyer-Taylor Center is a joint center with the business school and the law school here at Stanford. Our mission is to scale up the deployment of clean energy in the US and globally by designing and disseminating innovative policies and financial instruments, training the next generation of leaders, and convening and connecting academics, business leaders, policymakers, and investors. When I think about my role at the center, I think of myself as a problem solver and a dot connector. And connective tissue is actually a term I like to use as well. So I like to leverage the resources of Stanford faculty, research, students, staff, to harness all of that effort towards climate solutions. So in particular, the problem that I think about every day, I think is best summed up by a statement I heard Christiana Figueres give at a summit on climate risk at the UN in January, hosted by Ceres, and I know Sue Reed's in the room. Shout out for Ceres there. What she said that really stuck with me was how capital is spent over the next 5 years will determine the fate of humanity. So I think about that, and I think about how, Melanie mentioned the $329 billion in global investment in clean energy, which is outstanding, particularly given the headwinds of this past year. But in order to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, we need to scale that level of investment up to $1 trillion per year over the next decade. So that means 3 times more investment in new energy technologies, new business models, and new deployments of existing technologies. And so in order to do that, it's a big challenge. I need to think about things in bite-sized pieces. So I think about it in terms of 3 particular lane lines that we're focused on at the center and I'm focused on in my work, which is how to help asset owners prepare their portfolios for 2 degrees, both on the in opportunities and the risks, how to reduce the cost of capital for clean energy companies and projects, which is a mix of policy innovation, but also crowding in new sources of capital, particularly, in my view, philanthropic and long-term sources of capital. Long-term being the intergenerational pools of assets that sit inside of sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, insurance companies, foundations, and family offices. And finally, some surgical strikes targeting the so-called valleys of death, which maybe many of you have heard about, which happen to companies and projects both in the innovation valley of death, which is the gap between government and university R&D and an opportunity that would get funding off down the street here in Sand Hill Road, and the commercialization valley of death, which is the sort of first of its kind deployment where the check sizes are too big for the risk capital that would traditionally fund risky projects and too risky, or at least perceived to be, for the traditional sources of financing for that scale. So on the solution side, what I spend my time working on are really, I talk about 3 things, and this is really, these panels are hard to capture everything in one fell swoop, so I'll put out seeds for conversations for the Q&A, and I also want to come back to this idea of mentorship. I think of my role at Stanford too as putting wind in the sails of all the great efforts that are going on, both on campus and across the country and around the world. This was an incredible platform to do that, so I have my hand up on that score as well. So on the solution side, on the portfolio side, we've at the center launched a workshop series called Investing in a New Climate that gathers asset owners together by cohort, because they each have a different set of opportunities and challenges, to better understand the data sources, tools, and strategies for measuring and managing climate exposure in a portfolio and capitalizing on innovation opportunities. So really, we see our role at the center as bringing the best and brightest together, having a conversation with no judgment and closed doors session to help set the intellectual high water mark for how portfolio management can evolve in light of climate change. So that's one solution pathway. Another is looking at the role of intermediaries and the design and creation of new intermediaries to better connect asset owners with investment opportunities in climate solutions. So I'll give a shout out. I know Sarah Carney was here earlier. I think she's not in this room right now, but I'm on the board of an organization called Prime, which was founded and led by Sarah Carney, which helps connect philanthropic capital with Swing for the Fences energy innovation opportunities. And that really addresses this gap that exists on the foundation side with a interest and recognition of the need to put more resources into energy innovation, but a lack of resources internally at those in those shops to evaluate the opportunities from a scientific perspective, from an investment perspective. So Prime plays the role of an intermediary to better connect capital. Another intermediary that I want to mention here is something called the aligned intermediary, which I use in air quotes because it was never actually intended to be called that, but it moves so quickly that is now the name of a new advisory service for long-term investors to help them invest directly in clean energy innovation and deployment opportunities. This is a really neat example of how climate solutions can be birthed out of a university in partnership with the government. This was a project that was designed under the spotlight of the White House's Clean Energy Investment Initiative, which set a goal of mobilizing $2 billion of new investment from institutional investors, foundations, and family offices. And they held a summit in June to really, this was all part of the putting points on the board in the lead up to Paris to show the action and interest among the private sector in investing in climate solutions. And so I, along with a colleague at the Global Project Center here at Stanford and Sarah Carney, co-authored a paper that looked at the design of a new intermediary that could overcome the existing barriers, and we can get to that in the Q&A for long-term investors. Yeah, and we were able to raise $1 billion of pledged capital from 5 different long-term investors because of the collaboration with academia and the government and the private sector, with the idea that if we build this intermediary, they will come. And we can talk more about it in Q&A, but we were able to raise money to get that project off the ground.
Thank you for that wonderful array of what you've been doing. Maria, given our time, if you can just jump in a little bit about, all the activities within a large-scale utility that's looking ahead and how that plays a role.
So my comments are really going to sound a lot more local than the prior comments, but partly because of the geography of Southern California, Edison. But we talk a lot about transformational change at the office too, and it's being pushed by policy. It's being pushed by our customers, frankly, technology, and their choices around technology. And so our mission is really to provide safe, affordable, reliable, clean power to our customers. And we have to figure out a way to take all of the things that we've just talked about from a policy perspective and operationalize that. And so over the years in California, it's really been something that we've been able to do because of the policies of the state as well. There's been a ton of energy efficiency and demand response, and we've helped to operationalize that. There's been a lot around renewable procurement, and we've helped to standardize those PPAs so that people can actually get projects off the ground. And as we look forward, we're starting to see other things that our customers are really interested in. So in California, we probably represent about 50% of the distributed solar generation that's out there in the US. And we probably represent about 40% of electric vehicle sales. And we know that our customers want more of that. And there are proceedings going on in California that really focus on distributed energy resources and figuring out ways for those DERs to be part of the energy complex. And we think there are a lot of things that we can do to promote that, to operationalize that. We can think about DERs in the context of our normal system planning. We can think about new ways to procure them. We can think about ways to reinforce the grid so that more of our customers can make choices around that. And we think that that's a natural extension of our role in operationalizing the work that is going on in sustainable energy.
Great, thank you. Melanie, I wanted to follow up with a question that so much of what we hear and a lot of the focus on R&D is on the development of new technologies, which is obviously incredibly important. But in your work and what we've talked about this morning, how much do you see the need for R&D and developing new approaches on markets and the regulatory side and the institutional side, in part because, as Alicia said, we have academic institutions, national labs, various places, the private sector developing this new technology, but having it get out there in the world of energy because there are so many institutions and markets all combining. Do you have any thoughts on how R&D can be used in this area?
So one of the things we're really keen is to actually marry the R&D that's happening with the enabling environments and to make sure that the absorptive capacity in those host countries are actually able to take in either the R&D or a lot of times that R&D, whatever kind of fruit that R&D bears in the future years, to make sure that those countries are ready to take on that, whatever that is, the new technology that comes out of that space. And so we're excited about Mission Innovation and also the Breakthrough Coalition because they're really starting to create the future path forward of where we go. Well, where we're also working at State Department is also the near-term deployment of innovative business models, the near-term deployment of existing shelf-ready technologies into key emerging markets and key developing country markets. One of the places, for instance, in Africa, through Power Africa, we have transaction advisors throughout the region. We also have embassies and embassy officers looking at what are some of the systemic challenges at the regulator level. So as you mentioned on utilities, how do you bring together the utilities in the United States that are doing this well, that have a long track record overcoming various hurdles over the course of their time? How do you marry some of that knowledge through a peer-to-peer exchange with some utilities in Africa that are also starting to grapple with some of the similar challenges? Same with the regulator side of the house. How do you bring some of the peer-to-peer networks together to have this conversation, to understand what we've been able to unlock domestically and what can be done internationally as well? And so it's all, again, part of the spectrum that we feel that we can bring together the various components of it to create a really nice, comprehensive, and frankly more holistic and ideally more sustainable and more effective solution package for the energy challenges that lay ahead.
Great. Well, one quick question to Maria, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. One of the things that Sally had mentioned in her remarks this morning under that slide she had, and the last one was behavior, and I've forgotten the other name, but it was something that we think about here at Stanford, which is we may have the right set of solutions, but ultimately our way forward in energy and climate is going to involve the public and people in their lives and their businesses saying, this is something that we want, this is something that we value. And as a utility that is really on the ground, so to speak, of trying to make this change, do you have any thoughts on how do you get customers, people, their businesses, in their very busy lives, actually thinking about our path on clean energy and saying this is something we want to make part of our lives?
Well, the customer is incredibly important to us at SCE, and it's a really critical factor in really getting these policies to work effectively. I think a lot of what it takes in terms of involving the customer is, first, you have to make it easy. The information has to be available. People have to have access to information about their own utilization, about their energy usage, about their patterns. And as people start to get that information in a really easy way, so from websites, what have you, that really helps in terms of the educational process. I think you also have to think really hard about streamlining all of the processes around being more, whether it's energy efficient or having more renewable energy in the portfolio. Back when solar rooftop first started to gain ground here in California, it would take us up to, say, 30 days to process applications. And over time, through process improvement and other innovations, we've reduced that down to 5 days, in some cases, less than 1 day, or as low as 1 day. So it's really about making the experience, I think, as easy as possible to help reinforce, I think, what the customers in the state already want.
Great. Great. Well, let me ask if there are any questions that folks have in the audience. And unless somebody tells me we have a different approach, I think just raise your hand. And please do say your name and who you're with, and then just ask the questions. I don't know if we're using mics or just otherwise. Yes, okay, great. Jenny's bringing the mic.
Thank you. My name is Libby DeLucia. I'm an MBA student at MIT, co-president of the MIT Energy Club. My question is for Melanie. Are there any successful or unsuccessful precedents for creating enabling environments for development type investments?
Do you want to do groups of questions, or you want to do one at a time?
Pardon?
Do you want to do groups of questions or one at a time?
Let's just do them one at a time.
Great. So in terms of successes and failures, we obviously have both, and don't like to often talk about failures, but we do learn a lot from our failures. One of the failures, frankly, I won't name the country because that, again, is not very diplomatic, is there's a country where we wanted to work with them. We had various commitments from senior leadership to engage on renewable energy, but really where it broke down was on political will, frankly. And it was one where we thought with the right person, that this person committed to wind this information to work collaboratively with us, that was sufficient. But then in learning more about how their political levers actually work, it turned out this person didn't have the support of the parliament, and without that, we really couldn't move forward the legislative policies that were needed to make these certain reforms happen. And that's really where we came down to sort of a tripod of 3 necessary ingredients from a foreign policy perspective that make this work. The 3 aspects are political will, policy, governance, sorry, it's 4, and finance. So I guess it's 3, but then political will overlays the tripod. So it's policy, governance, and finance. And with all 3, those are all critical ingredients, but what's necessary for it to actually all stick together is actually the political will, and to really make it sustainable and transformative. And that's been really what, frankly, lately has really tipped the scales on successes or failures, is really how much political will is there, because oftentimes, especially for some of these countries with monopolies or state-owned energy institutions, or incumbents, frankly, that are really resisting the uptake of off-grid or uptake of renewables, because it's either seen as a threat because they fully don't understand how it can actually help with peaking and how to balance the system, how we can actually have those conversations. And it really did break down along the lines of those who didn't have that type of drive to really move it forward. And that's where, through diplomatic efforts, we've been helping to highlight where there actually is not just an academic interest in it or a technical interest, but there also is the highest level political will to actually see that enabling framework move forward.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks to a great panel. I'm Amy Barnes with Allotrope Partners. I wanted to sort of tease out some of what Alicia had been talking about on the aligned intermediary. So Allotrope is working on early stage project development in mostly emerging markets. And so I know we've talked about it a little bit, but I would be just sort of interested to hear your thoughts a little bit more on the aligned intermediary concept, because I think that's something we think is hugely valuable in terms of helping make projects happen. And then Melanie, would just love to hear your thoughts, both some of the work that you are doing at State Department on helping existing technologies get deployed in projects, and specifically getting over some of the later stage valleys of death that Alicia mentioned, and whether you guys have asks of companies like Allotrope that are trying to do projects and deploy capital in emerging economies. How can we be sort of helping to support the diplomatic efforts that you're doing in terms of building out those markets?
Sure. I'll start. Thanks for the question, Amy. So sure, I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about the aligned intermediary very briefly, because I see we're getting the 5-minute heads up. So what we did in designing it was really look at the barriers that exist currently that are keeping these long-term investors on the sidelines largely. So of that, $329 billion, and I'm going to mix my numbers here because the statistic I have is from a few years prior, but only about $1 billion of that was from institutional investors in terms of project finance. So there's a huge opportunity to crowd more capital in from these long-term investors, but the challenge has been the intermediaries that exist for those investors are not necessarily aligned with those opportunities. So their choices really are to build their own direct capacity with their own teams, or to work through funds. And there are challenges to both, particularly in this sector, in terms of the costs associated with that, the human capital required, which ties back to the costs, and the time frame. So particularly on the fund side, most of the, when you're looking to invest in climate infrastructure, a 10-year closed-end fund doesn't make a lot of sense. These are assets you want to hold longer. And there can be often a misalignment between what's in the best interest of the general partners who are managing the fund and what would be in the best interest of the ultimate owners, the limited partners, excuse me, who have their investment capital deployed. So what the aligned intermediary does is effectively build an outsourced in-house deal team for these investors that works as a co-op. So the investors pay in on an annual basis to have this team out there sourcing, vetting, and structuring investment opportunities. Now, what's interesting as we go is looking at the alignment of the design and launch of a new, effectively entrepreneurial venture, and what's the optimal objective from a climate perspective. And I think, and I'm going to give a shout back out to Allotrope on this, I think the folks that are really looking to layer capital by bringing in the development finance institutions and governments and philanthropic sources of capital to de-risk these projects and get some of the harder to finance projects, package investment opportunities such that projects that wouldn't otherwise get done are getting done because of the work of new intermediaries that are working together. And a shout out to C3E here. I think in my experience, women are particularly well equipped to be thinking more broadly, thinking about how to collaborate across sort of non-traditional pathways to bring more voices and solutions providers to the table rather than working sort of a set playbook. So I'm finding both in the experience of the Aligned Intermediary and the folks that I've had the pleasure of talking to as we build this thing to work with a lot of women who are pioneering on this challenge.
Melanie.
And I'll keep my response quick. But one of the things that we're trying to do more of is in the Foreign Service, which is where the State Department's a mix of political appointees, Foreign Service officers, and career service, civil service staff. And in the Foreign Service, they rotate on a 2 to 3 year basis throughout different countries, throughout different embassies. And the economic officers, which often do a lot of the work on energy and environmental issues and sort of commercial promotion, they move through from everything from cyber and clean tech to energy, you name it. And so what we're trying to do more of, at least with the Energy Bureau, is to bring into their minds not just the traditional oil and gas and energy developers that have been around for years and have a very sort of well-trodden path of how to engage with ambassadors and embassies to move their interests forward, but also how do you sort of prop up or bring to the front of people's minds the clean energy, some of these smaller companies that want to deploy globally but don't necessarily have the long track record or know exactly who to call or how to make those pieces move. And so part of what I've been doing and what we're doing in the department is trying to identify some of those smaller companies or those innovative companies that are trying to deploy globally. How can we help make sure that their voices are heard at our embassies with our economic officers? We've done something where we're beta testing an app where it'll list by country the number of companies that are interested in either deploying in that market by technology, whether it's wind, solar, geothermal, energy efficiency, or companies that are frankly already deployed in that country with very little, that may have done it without any help from the US government at all, but found their own way into that marketplace. But we want to know that you all exist. So after that embassy officer has a meeting with their counterpart who wants to know more about solar, we then actually have a very easily accessible web page or an app, if you will, that can pull up the companies that are vetted through the US government, that are US government companies or US companies that are in this space that they can have access to. But that's one of the key ways is just to, again, bring to the front of people's minds the clean energy, the renewable energy opportunities, and the companies that are doing this. So from a project perspective, last October, the Secretary convened a climate investment forum. And part of that, we created this, what we called basically a lunch policy menu, if you will. And it included about 20 or so US government vehicles that include public resources to leverage private capital or private resources, all for climate and clean energy solutions. And I was just fascinated as we did this sort of data call to figure out what types of mechanisms there are that put some US government skin in the game to attract private capital. You had everything from USAID's Development Credit Authority to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Power Africa has some vehicles. Obviously, there's the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, but there's a range of US government vehicles that exist to do some of this. And so things like Aligned Intermediary and other mechanisms that really help create some sort of common platform is really important because there's a lot of interested stakeholders here. And what we're trying to do is figure out where are the right places, who are the conversations we should be having. C3E is a great example of a good platform where we're trying to let everyone here know we really want to help, be this connective tissue, be a voice both in country, overseas, to help inform either the host country or frankly our own diplomacy efforts with what are some successful programs that are happening or projects that are happening on the ground.
Great. I think unless I hear otherwise, we unfortunately are out of time, but I'm going to take the prerogative, one sentence each. What makes you passionate about clean energy? And after all these years, we've all been in it, you get up every day and say, I'm really, really excited about what I'm doing. What's the passion part of your job? Alicia, we'll start here and go to one sentence.
Well, first thing that comes to mind are my two girls who are 4 and 6, and the passion that they trigger is both to protect their future and their children's future, but also to inspire them to pursue creative challenges to real world problems.
Great. Melanie?
For me,
this is a surprise question, so.
I think Alicia sort of hit on it in her opening comments, which was, I feel like it can be done. And you take it from a bite-sized approach, but even though the enormity of the challenge sometimes may seem overwhelming, I've already seen over the course of my own career, successes already happening and concrete change and transformation, frankly, already happening. And I feel like we're now at the other side of that hill where the momentum, the snowball is already moving, and we're really starting to see this just grow and the momentum growing. And after Paris and after the latest investment figures and all the wealth of new companies in this market that are actually making a lot of money, that are telling their story, it just feels like we're in a moment now where it really can be done. It can seem daunting, but I'm incredibly bullish and optimistic about where we can go.
Great. Maria.
I think it's because you can see the impact it has on people. It's maybe one of the single most impactful things in a person's life is their access to energy. And the fact that we can do that in a clean way, in a sustainable way, it's real. It's absolutely real, and it makes a really big difference to be able to go into work every day and know that. And in particular, to also work with so many smart people who are doing the same thing.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Here comes Melanie. Are we done, or should we take any more questions? Okay, one more. Kateri. Oh, I'm sorry. Be sure and introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Kateri Callahan with the Alliance to Save Energy and probably a C3E ambassador. I have a question for Maria. A lot of the discussion on the panel has been about policy and finance and the role that it plays, but you mentioned the customer as a driver. And I wonder if you could spend a little bit of time talking about how you see the customer of the past, utility customer versus today. And are customers in California different and more enlightened? How's the customer driving what you're doing vis-a-vis these other big levers that are being pulled?
So everything that we do as a utility is in service of the customer. When it's that safe, affordable, reliable, clean energy, and that's what they want, and that's why we provide it. What we've seen a lot lately, and we filed, as did the other investor-owned utilities, filed a distribution resources plan last year. And really that plan is all around enabling customer choice around technologies. Customers are really driving distributed resources. Customers have really driven, in support of state policies, have driven the move to renewables. And so for us, it's really been figuring out how to deliver that in a really affordable and reliable way. We have to plan the system, so of course we have a lot of things to balance and when it comes to delivering what the customer wants, but it's really been very important for us, and it's really at the core of everything that we do. Whether California customers are more enlightened than the rest of the country, certainly the policies here are not in advance of every other state, but certainly in advance of some states. But I think that customers are not really that different from one place to another. I think ultimately we'll all end up in the same place.
Great. So I think we are done. Let's join in a round of applause for our panelists.